In 1969, while a student at Wits University, anti-apartheid activist John Schlapobersky was detained in solitary confinement, tortured and eventually deported. Half a century later, calling on memory and two diaries he kept at the time, one written on toilet paper and the other in the Bible he was allowed, he reconstructs in moving detail the struggle for survival that finally transformed his life. In this conversation, he speaks about the reasons that drove him to tell his story.
It was the anniversary of my arrest, 50 years on, that led me to think, I've got to do it now, or it may be too late. So I set out to write it, prompted by a visit to the NASA space station just outside Houston, Texas. I was there for a conference where I was honored with a warm receipt of my previous book, which is a book written for psychotherapists called From the Couch to the Circle. I'm a practicing psychotherapist and I specialize in working with groups. So whilst in Houston, I went to visit the NASA space station on a morning off, and I saw the command center at the NASA space station from where the Apollo modules were controlled, and saw the speaker from which Neil Armstrong's voice came, saying, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Well, when he landed on the moon, I knew nothing about it because I was in prison. Just in passing, one of the guards told me the next day that there were men on the moon. And I tried to see the moon that night, but my prison cell was facing the wrong way. Listening to the sound of the men singing through the night, awaiting execution the next day, I too was fearful I might never see the moon again. So, prompted by this moving visit to NASA, I thought, I've got to write this story down.
Right. The ordeal that you went through, and I can imagine was not far behind, even after you were released from prison and when we went into the new democracy, etc. Did you find that in writing the book that there were parts of it that were therapeutic, that you were finally getting to deal with some of the stuff that you went through?
Yes, thank you for asking that, Anastasia. It wasn't therapeutic at the time. After all, I was only in the cell and under interrogation altogether for 55 days. But writing it all down was a 2-year project. So I was back in that cell for a much longer period writing than ever I had experienced. But the aftermath now is the time of therapy. I did write into the back end of my foreword, right at the front end of the book, that a time has come in which the many thousands and tens of thousands of people subjected to ordeals like this by the apartheid government could celebrate and honor the lives of their own loved ones who were sent into darkness on their own under such adverse conditions. So I've written the book not only on my own account, but to honor the many who were subjected to equivalent and much worse treatment.
I'm curious, as a 21-year-old in that period, were there any pivotal figures that had an influence on you, especially in the way that they saw South Africa at the time?
Oh yes, most definitely. The community in which I'd grown up, my earlier years were spent in Johannesburg, and we then emigrated to Swaziland because my parents didn't want to raise their children under the system of what was called Christian national education, the apartheid educational system. So our teenage years, my teenage years, were spent in Swaziland, and then I came back to university in South Africa. The community of Jewish Johannesburg in which I'd been raised was quite radically divided, like much of the country, between those who bought into the system, flourished in it, and profited from it, and those who opposed it. And we were much closer to the opposition. So we had followed the Rivonia trials, And the figure of Nelson Mandela and the 7 others convicted with him remained with us as sources of great inspiration. We were related by marriage to some of the people arrested at that time. So Arthur Goldreich was a distant relative who used to spend time in his younger years on my grandfather's farm, just northwest of Johannesburg, outside Krugersdorp. And I was especially inspired by the significant number of leaders in both the South African Communist Party and the ANC who came from Jewish backgrounds like my own. When I later arrived in London, I arrived with nothing really as a political refugee looking for asylum. The people who came forward to help me once I set up inquiries through a small South African network were Albie Sachs and his then wife Stephanie Kemp, acting for the ANC. I didn't know that they were at the front end of the underground agency, but I knew that they represented the opposition I had allegiance towards. And they sought out sources of support that helped me raise a scholarship to continue my university studies.
Yeah.
And introduced me to the International Defence and Aid Fund, who provided support to apartheid opposition figures like myself and many others.
Someone might think 55 days is not a long time, but as a 21-year-old, being surrounded by the characters that you describe in the book, Swanepoel being one of them, how did you find the strength to keep going? Because anything could have happened.
Well, indeed, anything could have happened. And I could hear, when I was later in solitary confinement, the cries of people in the night, cries of horror and pain and anguish. So I was surrounded by people in peril. The most immediate peril I faced entirely on my own. I had been arrested from a lecture theatre at Wits on a Friday morning, and the university administration, who had been approached by the security police to find me that morning, led them straight to me at the lecture theatre, and the administrator called me out and then disappeared. I walked out into the arms of these 3 security police officers, who told me they were arresting me under the Terrorist Act, which I knew by then to be a dreadful prospect. But I said to this mob of threatening men, please could I see a lawyer? Well, it was very provocative, and they became even more enraged and threatening.
Yeah.
And then the next piece of chutzpah came when I said, excuse me, but please, if you want me to answer your questions, would you speak to me in English? I don't understand a word you're saying. And then Swanepoel became red in the face. He was already frightening, but now he was a source of terror. And his indignation that I couldn't speak Dital provoked terrible fury from him. And they forced me into a little room where they slammed the big steel window shut on the street and filled the room with a mob of these police screaming at me. I thought I would die there. And even now, as I describe this to you, that period of terror comes back to me.
Well, if you're interested in how the book ends, you can get yourself a copy of John Schlapobersky's book, When They Came For Me.